I was 9 years old when I began to suspect that my father was a gangster. It was Sunday, and Dad had us all packed into the car for an afternoon of house hunting. He loved driving around different neighborhoods, pointing out houses he liked and sharing his renovation ideas. One particular Sunday, we were cruising around Toad Hill, an upscale community on the southern end of Staten Island, filled with homes owned by doctors, lawyers, and businessmen. Mom was in the front seat with Dad, and my younger brother Gerard and I were buckled in the back. My father had just finished the renovations on our 3-bedroom house he'd bought for us in Bull's Head, a primarily blue-collar neighborhood just over the Verrazano Bridge and not far from the 2-bedroom apartment we had been renting in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. My father was obsessed with construction and remodeling. He ripped apart and remodeled every place we'd ever lived in. He started tearing apart the new house the minute we had taken ownership, knocking down walls and putting in improvements like nice European tiles. My brother and I attended the local public school PS 60. My mother would walk me to school every day. I had some good friends there, but Dad's friend Louis Melito was forever suggesting that he transfer me to the private prep school on the Hill. His daughter Dina went there, and so did Doria Lafort. Her grandfather was a big player in the Gambino crime family. The Hill had large manicured homes dotting its steep streets and was about 10 minutes from our 3-bedroom house on Leggett Place. Anyone who was anybody lived on the Hill. One particular house in this fancy neighborhood belonged to Gambino family crime boss Paul Castellano. We were on one of our Sunday expeditions when Dad pointed it out to us. It was an enormous monster of a house unlike any other in the neighborhood. It was way fancier and more ornate. It looked more like an Italian villa or a museum, with its iron gates and gigantic fountain spewing water in the middle of the large circular brick driveway filled with expensive cars and incredibly manicured grounds. It must have cost a fortune. There was an elaborate security system with surveillance cameras monitoring the perimeter, which seemed to span an entire block. "Wow," I said, "what does Paul do that he has such a big house?" "He's in the construction business," my father replied. I remember thinking how glad I was my father worked in the same business as Paul, so that maybe one day we could get a mansion like that. Dad didn't say Paul was his boss in one of New York's biggest, most bloodletting, most feared crime families, or that the construction business wasn't building someone a little house, but more like construction, racketeering, loan sharking, and extortion. He didn't mention being a businessman like Paul was putting your life on the line. I'd have to wait to learn this angle of the business. By the fall, my father announced that I was going to be transferring to a new school. He wanted me to get a superior education and had me enroll at the prestigious Staten Island Academy. I was furious about leaving my friends and worried that I wouldn't fit in with the kids at the private school. I was there just a few weeks when a classmate invited me over to her house to play. She lived so close to the school we could see the playground from her yard. It was a beautiful day and we were outside on her front lawn. Her mother had just gone inside to make us some lemonade when my friend made a startling announcement. "My mother and father say a big gangster lives in that house," she said, pointing across the street to the Castellano estate. I knew that Paul was Dad's friend, but I put 2 and 2 together and decided if Paul Castellano was a gangster, my father must be one too. He just didn't act like a gangster. My idea of a gangster was Vito Corleone, the fictional mob boss in The Godfather. The movie had even been filmed a few blocks from my school. Still, I had been confronted with the possibility my father was connected before. When I was 6, I found a gun in my parents' bedroom in our apartment on 61st Street in Bensonhurst. Mom was in the kitchen and I was amusing myself by hiding some of my favorite books under their bed. That's when I came upon the pistol Dad had stuffed beneath the mattress. I knew my father had served in the Army during the Vietnam War because I had seen his dog tags. I wondered if this was a souvenir from the war. Racing to the kitchen, I went to ask my mother about my startling discovery. "Mommy, does Daddy have a gun because he was in the Army?" "Yeah," was all she could muster. The next day, I bragged to my friends at school, telling them my father had a gun under the bed because he was in the Army. My teacher overheard me and went directly to my mother. When Dad found out, he wasn't upset. He just told me not to talk about it anymore. My father had this coolness about him. He was hipper than the other kids' dads. He wore sweats and gold chains, and he had tattoos, Jesus on one arm and a rose on the other. He also had a small diamond in the middle of his chest. He owned nightclubs and always stayed out late. Some of his friends were bouncers. They dressed and spoke differently from the dads of the other kids at school. They had wads of cash in their pockets and always came bearing gifts, even if it was just a box of pastries on Sunday. On weekends, my father would sometimes take me with him to the club in Bensonhurst. I didn't know it then, but it was a local mobster hangout, also known as a men's social club. Dad would first get the car washed, and then we'd stop in. Guys would be playing cards and drinking coffee. The club looked like a big kitchen with tables and chairs set out around the room and a few pictures, mostly scenes of Italy, hanging on the walls. There were no women around ever. An older man named Tato was usually at the table in the back. He was always nicely dressed in slacks and a sweater, sporting a big fancy watch and a pinky ring. "Hey, Bo, what's up?" my father would say. It's how he addressed everyone, even me. I didn't know why he addressed people as Bo and not Bro. "Go say hello to Uncle Tato," he instructed, pushing me in the old man's direction. I'd have to go over and hug and kiss him. "Hey, how you doing, kiddo?" he'd ask. The old man would pat me on the head and then stick a $20 bill in my pocket. I thought it was weird the way the men all kissed each other on the cheeks and then exchanged a firm handshake. No one just walked into a room and said hello. It was always a handshake, and there always seemed to be an order of whose hand should be shaken first. Obviously, I didn't know that Tato was Salvatore Tato Arello, a capo in the Gambino crime family, my father's boss and mentor in the mob. I just thought Dad respected him more because he was older. It wasn't until I was 12 years old that I knew for certain my father was a gangster. Even then, I knew not to ask any questions.